Good morning, Yellow 6 students. This is Mrs. Kama, and for language arts today, we're first going to start off with correcting your homework on characterization. So please open up your assignment on characterization that you had just worked on. Okay, and let's go over the answers. Now, if you got the answer incorrect, make sure you type in what the correct answer should be so that way you can study for your formative. All right. So the directions was you needed to match the statements below with the character clues they represent, and you may use the clues more than once. So number 1, Tim was worried about his math grade. That's an example of feelings. Number 2, Dean gently lifted the baby bird back into its nest. That's an example of actions. Number 3, instead of helping her dad with yard work, Sonia snuck off to be with her friends. That's an example of choices. Okay, number 4, get out of my way, Tanya bellowed. That's an example of words. Number 5, Josh volunteered to help the teacher hand out textbooks. That's an example of actions. Number 6, I knew I could do better, and I promised myself I would train more before the next race. That is an example of thoughts. 7, Stella was disappointed that the game had been canceled. That is an example of feelings. Okay, number 8, Stephen thought about his behavior. I was wrong, and I need to apologize for what I said. That's an example of thoughts. Number 9, Brant saw the bus pull up to the bus stop, and knowing that no one was at home, he turned around and went back to his house. That is an example of choices. For number 10, it isn't my fault, said Samantha. That's an example of words. Okay, on the next page, you needed to match the statements below with the character clues they represent, and you could use the clues more than once. So for 11, Robert hid the remote control from his brother so he couldn't watch his favorite show. It should be the letter A, that Robert is cruel. Number 12, Lisa thanked the waitress for bringing her a soda. You should have marked C. Lisa is courteous. 13. Tim said, I just want to double check that I finish all parts of this project. You should have selected D. Tim is conscientious. 14. Al realized his plan wouldn't work out and said, well, we'll just try something else. You should have selected the letter D. Al is flexible. Number 15, Medora knew she would never tell Lorna's secret no matter what happened. You should have selected the letter B. Medora is discreet. Number 16, Howie jumped up and down when he was chosen to be on the team. Okay, the correct answer is D. Howie is enthusiastic. Okay, number 17. Even though she was only 12 years old, Jessica knew how to tend a garden, take care of farm animals, and sew her own clothes. The correct answer is B. Jessica is mature. 18. Mr. Stimson moved around the table using a ruler to make sure all of the plates were lined up exactly 3 inches from the edge of the table. The correct answer is C. Mr. Stimson is precise. Number 19. While she knew she'd rather have the expensive leather boots, Carla chose the more affordable shoes. The correct answer is B. Carla is practical. And number 20, Sarah checked her watch. She knew she would have to leave immediately to get to the meeting on time. The correct answer is the letter B. Sarah is punctual. Okay, so Make sure you made the necessary corrections if you got the answer wrong. If you did not get a chance to finish writing it in correctly, you can see your teachers at office hours, or you can rewatch this video and pause it so that you could go ahead and record it. Now, after going over this characterization, today we're going to be reading a story entitled Tanaika, and it's in the composition book where you're going to be doing an assignment. So I'd like to read the story with you at this time, entitled Tanaika. And as we read the story, I want you to think of, thoughts, words, feelings, choices, actions that the character experiences. Okay, because that's what your assignment for today will be on. Tanaika by Mary Whitebird. As my birthday drew closer, I had awful nightmares about it. I was reaching the age at which all Kaw Indians had to participate in Tanaika. Well, not all Kaws. Many of the younger families on the reservations were beginning to give up the old customs. But my grandfather, Amos Deer Lake, was devoted to tradition. He still wore handmade beaded moccasins instead of shoes and kept his iron gray hair in tight braids. He could speak English, but he spoke it only with the white men. With his family, he used the Sioux dialect. Grandfather was one of the last living Indians. He died in 1953 when he was 81, who actually fought against the U.S. cavalry. Not only did he fight, he was wounded in a skirmish at Rose Creek, a famous encounter in which the celebrated Kaw chief Flatnose lost his life. At the time, my grandfather was only 11 years old. 11 was a magic word among the Kaws. It was the time of Tanaika, the flowering of adulthood. It was the age, my grandfather informed us hundreds of times, when a boy could prove himself to be a warrior and a girl took the first steps to womanhood. I don't want to be a warrior, my cousin Roger Deerlake confided to me. I'm going to become an accountant. Okay, if you look on the bottom, it gives you information that the Sioux dialect, one of the language spoken by the Plains Indians, including the Kaw. None of the other tribes make girls go through the endurance ritual, I complained to my mother. It won't be as bad as you think, Mary, my mother said, ignoring my protests. Once you've gone through it, you'll certainly never forget it. You'll be proud. I even complained to my teacher, Mrs. Richardson, feeling that, as a white woman, she would side with me. She didn't. All of us have rituals of one kind or another, Mrs. Richardson said, and look at it this way. How many girls have the opportunity to compete on equal terms with boys? Don't look down on your heritage. Heritage indeed. I had no intention of living on a reservation for the rest of my life. I was a good student. I loved school. My fantasies were about knights in armor and fair ladies in flowing gowns being saved from dragons. It never once occurred to me that being an Indian was exciting. But I've always thought that the Kaw were the originators of the women's liberation movement. No other Indian tribe, and I've spent half a lifetime researching the subject, treated women more equally than the Kaw. Unlike most of the subtribes of the Sioux Nation, the Kaw allowed men and women to eat together, and hundreds of years before, we were acculturated. A Kaw woman had the right to refuse a prospective husband, even if her father arranged a match. The wisest women Generally, wisdom was equated with age, often sat in tribal councils. Furthermore, most call legends revolve around good women, a kind of squaw, Joan of Arc of the high plains. Good women led calm warriors into battle after battle, from which they always seemed to emerge victorious. And girls as well as boys were required to undergo Tanaika. The actual ceremony varied from tribe to tribe, but since the Indian life on the plains was dedicated to survival, Tanaika was a test of survival. Endurance is the loftiest virtue of the Indian, my grandfather explained. To survive, we must endure. When I was a boy, Tanaika was more than the mere symbol it is now. We were painted white with the juice of sacred herb and sent naked into the wilderness without so much as a knife. We couldn't return until the white had worn off. It wouldn't wash off. It took almost 18 days, and during that time, we had to stay alive, trapping food, eating insects and roots and berries, and watching out for enemies. And we did have enemies, both the white soldiers and the Omaha warriors, who were always trying to capture boys and girls undergoing their endurance tests. It was an exciting time. What happened if you couldn't make it? Roger asked. He was born only 3 days after I was, and we were being trained for Tanaika together. I was happy to know he was frightened too. Many didn't return, grandfather said. Only the strongest and shrewdest. Mothers were not allowed to weep over those who didn't return. If a call couldn't survive, he or she wasn't worth weeping over. It is our way. Sorry. What a lot of hooey, Roger whispered. I'd give anything to get out of it. I don't see how we have any choice, I replied. Roger gave my arm a little squeeze. Well, it's only 5 days. 5 days. Maybe it was better than being painted white and sent out naked for 18 days, but not much better. We were to be sent, barefoot and in bathing suits, into the woods. Even our very traditional parents put their foot down when grandfather suggested we go naked. For 5 days we had to live off the land, keeping warm as best we could, getting food where we could. It was May, but on the northernmost reaches of the Missouri River, the days were still chilly and the nights were fiercely cold. Grandfather was in charge of the month's training for the Tanaika. One day, he caught a grasshopper and demonstrated how to pull its leg and wings off in one flick of the finger and how to swallow it. I felt sick, and Roger turned green. It's a darn good thing it's 1947, I told Roger teasingly. You'd make a terrible warrior. Roger just grimaced. Okay, here's some words. Loftiest means noblest or highest. Shrewdest means cleverest, sharpest. And grimace means twisted face to express pain, anger, or disgust. I knew one thing. This particular Kaw Indian girl wasn't going to swallow a grasshopper no matter how hungry she got. And then I had an idea. Why hadn't I thought of it before? It would have saved nights of bad dreams about squishy grasshoppers. I headed straight for my teacher's house. Mrs. Richardson, I said, would you lend me $5? $5, she exclaimed. For what? You remember the ceremony I talked about? Tanaika, of course. Your parents have written me and asked me to excuse you from school so you can participate in it. Well, I need some things for the ceremony, I replied in half-truth. I don't want to ask my parents for the money. It's not a crime to borrow money, Mary, but how can you pay it back? I'll babysit for you 10 times. That's more than fair, she said, going to her purse and handing me a crisp new $5 bill. I've never had that much money at once. I'm happy to know the money's going to be put to good use, Mrs. Richardson said. A few days later, the ritual began with a long speech from my grandfather about how we had reached the age of decision, how we now have to fend for ourselves and prove that we could survive the most horrendous of ordeals. All the friends and relatives who had gathered at our house for dinner made jokes about their own Tanaika experiences. They all advised us to fill up now, since the next 5 days we'll be gorging ourselves on crickets. Neither Roger nor I was very hungry. I probably laughed about this when an accountant, Roger said, trembling. Are you trembling? I asked. What do you think? I'm happy to know boys tremble too, I said. At 6 the next morning, we kissed our parents and went off to the woods. Which side do you want? Roger asked, according to rules. Roger and I would stake out territories in separate areas of woods, and we weren't to communicate during the entire ordeal. I'll go towards the river if it's okay with you, I said. Sure, Roger answered. What difference does it make? To me, it made a lot of difference. There was a marina a few miles up the river, and there were boats moored there. At least I hope so. I figured that a boat was better placed to sleep than under a pile of leaves. Why do you keep holding your head? Roger asked. Oh, nothing. Just nervous, I told him. Actually, I was afraid I'd lose the $5 bill, which I had tucked into my hair with a bobby pin. As we came to a fork in the trail, Roger shook my hand. Good luck, Mary. Nekoneta, I said. It was a call word for courage. The sun was shining and it was warm, but my bare feet began to hurt immediately. I spied one of the berry bushes Grandfather had told us about. You're lucky, he had said. The berries are ripe in the spring and they are delicious and nourishing. They're orange and fat, and I popped one into my mouth. Ugh! I spat it out. It was awful and bitter, and even grasshoppers were probably better tasting, although I never intended to find out. I sat down to rest my feet. A rabbit hopped out from under the berry bush. He nuzzled the berry I spat out and ate it. He picked another one and ate that too. He liked them. He looked at me, twitching his nose. I watched a red-headed woodpecker bore into an elm tree. I caught a glimpse of a civet cat waddling through some twigs. All of a sudden, I realized I was no longer frightened. Tanaika might be more fun than I anticipated. I got up and headed toward the marina. Not one boat, I said to myself dejectedly, but the restaurant on the shore, Ernie's Riverside, was open. I walked in, feeling silly in my bathing suit. The man at the counter was big and tough-looking. He wore a sweatshirt with the words Fort Sheridan, 1944, and he had only 3 fingers on one of his hands. He asked me what I wanted. A hamburger and a milkshake, I said, holding the $5 bill in my hand, so he knew I had money. That's a pretty heavy breakfast, honey, he murmured. That's what I always have for breakfast, I lied. 47 cents, he said, bringing me the food. Back in 1947, hamburgers were 25 cents and milkshakes were 20 cents. Delicious, I thought, better than grasshoppers, and Grandfather never once mentioned that I couldn't eat hamburgers. While I was eating, I had a grand idea. Why not sleep in the restaurant? I went to the ladies' room and made sure the window was unlocked. Then I went back outside and played along the riverbank, watching the water birds and trying to identify each one. I planned to look for a beaver dam the next day. The restaurant closed at sunset, and I watched a three-fingered man drive away. Then I climbed in the unlocked window. There was a night light on, so I didn't turn on any lights. But there was a radio on the counter. I turned it on to a music program. It was warm in the restaurant and I was hungry. I helped myself to a glass of milk and a piece of pie, intending to keep a list of what I've eaten so I could leave money. I also planned to get up early, sneak out through the window, head for the woods before the three-fingered man returned. I turned off the radio, wrapped myself in the man's apron, and in spite of the hardness of the floor, fell asleep. "What the heck are you doing here, kid?" It was a man's voice. It was morning. I overslept. I was scared. "Hold it, kid. I just want to know what you're doing here. You lost? You must be from the reservation. Your folks must be worried sick about you. Do they have a phone?" Yes, I answered, "but don't call them." I was shivering. The man who told me his name was Ernie made me a cup of hot chocolate while I explained about Tana Ika. "Darnest thing I ever heard," he said when I was through. "Lived next to the reservation all my life, and this is the first I've heard of Tana, whatever you call it." He looked at me, all goosebumps in my bathing suit. "Pretty silly thing to do to a kid," he muttered. That was just what I'd been thinking for months. But when Ernie said it, I became angry. "No, it isn't silly. It's a custom of the call. We've been doing this for hundreds of years. My mother and my grandfather and everybody in my family went through this ceremony. It's why calls are great warriors." "Okay, great warrior," Ernie chuckled. "Suit yourself, and if you want to stick around, it's okay with me." Ernie went to the broom closet, tossed me a bundle. "That's the lost and found closet," he said. "Stuff people left on boats. Maybe there's something to keep you warm." The sweater fitted loosely, but it felt good. I felt good, and I found a new friend. Most important, I was surviving Tana Ika. My grandfather had said the experience would be filled with adventure, and I was having my fill. And father had never said we couldn't accept, grandfather said we couldn't accept hospitality. So I stayed at Ernie's Riverside for the entire period. In the mornings, I went into the woods and watched the animals and picked flowers for each of the tables in Ernie's. I had never felt better. I was up early enough to watch the sunrise on the Missouri. I went to bed after it set. I ate everything I wanted, insisting that Ernie take all my money for the food. "I'll keep this in a trust for you, Mary," Ernie promised, "in case you are ever desperate for $5. He did too, but that's another story. I was sorry when the 5 days were over. I enjoyed every minute with Ernie. He taught me how to make Western omelets and to make chili, Ernie style, still one of my favorite dishes. And I told Ernie all about the legends of the call. I hadn't realized I knew so much about my people. But Tana Ika was over, and as I approached my house at about 9:30 in the evening, I became nervous all over again. What if grandfather asked me about the berries and the grasshoppers? And my feet were hardly cut. I hadn't lost a pound, and my hair was combed. They'll be so happy to see me, I told myself hopefully, that they won't ask too many questions. I opened the door. My grandfather was in the front room. He was wearing the ceremonial beaded deerskin shirt which had belonged to his grandfather. "Nagad Dama," he said. "Welcome back." I embraced my parents warmly, letting go only when I saw my cousin Roger sprawled on the couch. His eyes were red and swollen. He'd lost weight. His feet were an unsightly mass of blood and blisters, and he was moaning, "I made it, see, I made it. I'm a warrior, a warrior." Grandfather looked at me strangely. Was clean, obviously well-fed, and radiantly healthy. My parents got the message. My uncle and aunt gazed at me with hostility. Finally, my grandfather asked, "What did you eat to keep you so well?" I sucked in my breath and blurted out the truth. "Hamburgers and milkshakes." "Hamburgers!" my grandfather growled. "Milkshakes!" Roger moaned. "You didn't say we had to eat grasshoppers," I said sheepishly. "Tell us all about your Tanaika, my grandfather commanded. I told them everything from borrowing the $5 to Ernie's kindness to observing the beaver. "That's not what I trained you for," my grandfather said sadly. I stood up. "Grandfather, I learned that Tanaika is important. I didn't think so during training. I was scared stiff of it. I handled it my way, and I learned I had nothing to be afraid of. There's no reason in 1947 to eat grasshoppers when you can eat a hamburger." I was inwardly shocked at my own audacity, but I liked it. "Grandfather, I'll bet you never ate one of those rotten berries yourself." Grandfather laughed. He laughed aloud. "Ha ha ha ha!" My mother and father and aunt and uncle were all dumbfounded. Grandfather never laughed. Never. "Those berries, they are terrible," grandfather admitted. "I could never swallow them. I found a dead deer on the first day of my Tanaika, shot by a soldier, probably, and he kept my belly full for the entire period of the test." Grandfather stopped laughing. "We should send you out once again," he said. I looked at Roger. "You're pretty smart, Mary," Roger groaned. "I'd never have thought of what you did." "Accountants just have to be good at arithmetic," I said comfortingly. "I'm terrible at arithmetic." Roger tried to smile, but he couldn't. My grandfather called me to him. "You should have done what your cousin did, but I think you are more alert to what is happening to our people today than we are. I think you would have passed the test under any circumstances in any time. Somehow you know how to exist in a world that wasn't made for Indians. I don't think you're going to have any trouble surviving." Grandfather wasn't entirely right, but I'll tell about that another time. Okay, wasn't that a great story about Tanaika, the cultures of the call? Now what you are going to do is, and we have this link to this story so you can always refer back to it, but you are going to go into your resource book and you'll see on slide 11 there is a picture that you had glued in your composition book. Okay, in your composition book you glued in this visual on characterization. It has thoughts, words, feelings, choices, and actions. Now there is a flap on this. Okay, you should have a flap. So on the top of the flap, I want you to give me examples of thoughts that the character Mary had. On the top of the flap of words, I want you to give me words like text examples of what Mary experienced. So on the top flaps for each of this, you will give me text examples. Okay? So say, for example, thoughts. What is an example of thoughts that Mary had when she went to Tanaika. For example, she said, I had no intention of living on a reservation for the rest of my life. That's a thought she had mentioned, and you can use as an example. If I look at a text example for words, okay, she had said to Mrs. Richardson, I'll babysit for you 10 times. If you look at a text example for feelings, you'll see how Mary is angry when Ernie calls her customs silly. Look for a text example for choices. I would say how Mary orders food at Ernie's instead of eating insects in the woods. And if I look at a text example for her action, Mary confesses to the truth to her grandfather. Now, as I mentioned before, the top of the flaps are text examples. When you open the flap on the bottom, I want you to interpret, give your inference of the text example. So if I said for thoughts that Mary, the text example, she said, I had no intention of living on a reservation for the rest of my life, her inference may be that Mary is ambitious and she does not plan to be confined to her heritage. Going back to words, if my text example is, I'll babysit you for 10 times, my inference on that is that Mary is responsible. She is a clever thinker and she plans ahead. For feelings, if my text example is Mary is angry when Ernie calls her customs silly, underneath the flap, my inference would be that Mary is proud of her Kaw heritage after all. Under choices, if your text example is Mary orders food at Ernie's instead of eating insects in the woods, my inference for that would probably be that Mary is bold and not afraid to get what she wants. Under action, if my text example is Mary confessed the truth to her grandfather, for my inference, I would probably put that Mary is honest and respects her grandfather and their Kaw traditions. Now, refer back to your reading handout to go ahead and complete this. Again, the top of the flap will be the text examples from the reading. On the bottom of the flap is going to be your inference, okay, of what that text example means. When you are done with this class, then you are going to turn to your assignment. You're going to take a picture of this first. Take a picture and upload it onto your assignment slide 16. So you'll upload your language arts composition book picture of your Tanaika right on this slide. Okay? Now make sure you complete this. This is the last assignment for you to complete because your Language Arts Portfolio 1 is due tomorrow. And you have your formative. So you will be doing your study guide and going over that for tomorrow's formative. Study it. Alright? Good luck. If you have any further questions, feel free to see your Language Arts teacher during office hours. Have a great day. Aloha.